number of polio outbreaks continue to rise. It looks like 1952 was really a watershed year. The statistics that are often reported from that year, 57,000 plus cases, 3,100 plus deaths, and this is the shocking number of the 57,000, 21,269 cases of paralysis. So as that was happening, walk us through the development of vaccines. Where was that taking place around the country, and was it simply foundations who were supporting it, or was the government involved?
Sure, that's a really good question. So 1952 was a horrible year, and as you pointed out, those numbers, they gripped the nation with fear, and they're far lower than the coronavirus numbers that we're seeing today. So that might be another important lesson for us. But what happened was the foundation knew that it had to invest not just in treatment for polio patients, but also in either a cure or a means of prevention. And by the early 1950s, it was supporting a number of teams of scientists who were working on different types of vaccines. And eventually there were a couple of scientists who kind of pulled ahead of the pack. One group was working on a vaccine that used chemical treatment to inactivate, essentially kill the vaccine, so that this killed the virus, so that this killed virus could be put into a vaccine. And another group was developing a kind of more classic type of vaccine in which they effectively created a weakened version of the virus, and it was still polio virus, but it was supposed to not cause polio. There were a number of scientists working in both camps, and some of the research that they conducted, a lot of this was supported by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, but a number of these scientists had been heavily funded during the Second World War by the federal government, which had funded them to try to come up with vaccines during the war to protect troops, not from polio, but from things like the flu and measles and mumps, for instance. So there were a number of advances in vaccine science made during the war that some of these teams drew on as they were working hard to find a polio vaccine. There was one team at Harvard, I believe, which during the war was funded entirely by the government and was working around the clock 24/7 to try to develop a measles vaccine. And they developed some helpful techniques to culture the virus in the lab, but then as soon as the war ended, they shifted entirely, and by then they were being funded wholly by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, not to develop a measles vaccine, but to develop a polio vaccine. And the reason why I point this out is because, in effect, there was this sort of back and forth going on at the time. In war, we had a different set of priorities, and scientific attention was focused on those. After the war, our scientific priorities shifted again. Once we came up with a polio vaccine, then the technology that was developed to produce that polio vaccine was then used as the basis and inspiration for a number of vaccines that followed. And so we ended up with a bunch of new vaccines in the 1960s. So there was this sort of back and forth of scientific attention being focused on different diseases depending on what the national priority was at the time. And as we already know from the early clip at the top of the hour, the vaccine, the polio vaccine that made it across the finish line first was the one developed by Jonas Salk. And Salk was determined, absolutely determined, that he had the vision for what was going to be an effective vaccine. And with the foundation's help, one of the biggest vaccine trials was conducted with something like 1.2 million American children, and I think there were another 400,000 who were also tested in Canada and Finland. This was an unprecedented number of people participating in a trial of a new vaccine. And when the vaccine was fully tested in that enormous study population, it was shown to protect against what were then known to be 3 different types of polio virus. It was very effective against 2 of those viral types and mostly effective against the 3rd viral type. But such details didn't really matter to a country that was so desperate for anything to let them go back to normal.
So I have another historic video from the year 1954 as that massive testing was taking place. And this brings together a lot of threads because people will instantly recognize the use of celebrities to enjoin people to the cause. Let's watch.
You know, every child has a right to that, health and happiness.
That's right. But there are an awful lot of children that don't even have that.
Yes, Dusty. And there are a lot of parents whose children are healthy and happy now, who live in fear. I know I do. The fear, my friends, is polio, infantile paralysis.
Polio is no respecter of people. The rich, the poor, the strong, the weak, no one is immune.
But soon, perhaps within a year, there may be a vaccine available to all that may be the answer.
That's right. There is a trial vaccine now being tested. It has been tested successfully on 700 people. But now the vital large-scale tests must be conducted. Hundreds of thousands of people will be inoculated starting next month.
Vaccines and tests cost a great deal of money. Now here is your chance to help get this test done as quickly as possible. Give every dime and dollar that you can spare to the 1954 March of Dimes.
So as they talked about, that's Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, of course, and they talked about the enormous effort. Those numbers over globally, 1.8 million school children, 20,000 physicians were involved in testing in the United States, and 64,000 school officials. You've done so much work on vaccines. Was there not public resistance to being inoculated with a substance that was still being tested?
Absolutely. So there was resistance. That resistance did not get any media attention, pretty close to none at the time. So it's hard to find traces of it, but it was there. There was also incredible acceptance. And it strikes me as not too unlike the cases we see today of people very eager to sign up as participants in early tests of the current coronavirus vaccines that are in development. Back then, people were actually very, very excited to sign up their children for these trials.
Production was 1979. What took so long for it to be eradicated in the United States?
That's an interesting question. A historian would phrase it very differently and would say, wow, that was fast. If you think about it, the first smallpox vaccine was developed in the late 1790s, and I think the last smallpox case in the US, I think, was 1948. So for polio, that timeline seems quite compressed relative to smallpox. What happened with polio, to give you kind of a big picture view of what transpired after the first vaccine was approved, there was so much involvement and so much activity in the first few years after Salk's vaccine was approved that vaccination rates and coverage they skyrocketed. Millions and millions of people got vaccinated in those first couple of years, and polio cases plummeted between 1955 and 1957. Then what happened after 1957 was you started to see this kind of gradual departure between those who had the means, they could afford the time and the money to take their kids to the doctor on an annual basis, for instance. They, stayed up to date on the news and followed expert advice. These people continued to get their kids vaccinated, while other people, either who didn't have the means or weren't aware of the need, were getting their kids vaccinated at a far lower rate. And so in 1958 and 1959, you start to see polio cases creeping back up just a little bit, but starting to creep back up. And then we start seeing outbreaks, and these are predominantly happening in poor communities, in urban areas where poor communities are living in crowded conditions and are out of reach of access to healthcare and don't have routine visits to doctors, for instance. And in those areas, CDC epidemiologists and others start to realize that people just aren't getting vaccinated at the same rate. So we had this sort of push and pull throughout the late 50s into the 60s, and by the 70s, polio vaccination was really widespread among children, and by that time, we had enough immune adults that it became most important to focus on children, and we were capturing them at that point largely through laws that required vaccination for school. In the 1970s, however, it gradually became clear that the remaining cases of polio in the country were those caused by the live virus vaccine, which sometimes led to community transmission of polio virus as the virus was shed, say, for example, in the fecal matter of children. So we then started to move away from that vaccine and switch back to the Salk vaccine, and effectively finally got to a place where we had no more polio in this country.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to spend that last 10 minutes talking about the lessons for today. Let's begin with President Trump just a few days ago talking about the development of vaccines.
Tremendous progress is being made on vaccines. In fact, we have ready to go in terms of transportation and logistics. We have over 2 million ready to go if it checks out for safety.
So you co-authored a piece in the New York Times, which gave us the idea for talking to you further about this, about the cautionary notes. So what are the kinds of challenges that the American public should be aware of about the development, safe development, and distribution of a coronavirus vaccine?
Sure. Well, one of the first of them is the fact that any vaccine that's tested is tested in a large group of people, but not nearly as large a group of people as it will ultimately be used in. So in this country, we try to monitor as best we can vaccines as they're used so that we can keep tabs on any unwanted side effects that only show up, say, when 1 million or 2 million people have received the vaccine. So that's one thing that I think we need to keep in mind. I think the other one is we have, I think it's well over 100 different vaccines in development right now, all using different approaches to vaccine development. And this means that there may be a top vaccine candidate that uses a technology that we haven't used or haven't used extensively before. And we may be calling, as we did in the days of polio, on manufacturers who haven't actually manufactured a product like this before. So we don't, in such a case, we again won't know if there have been manufacturing problems until the vaccines are widely used. I don't mean to sound exceptionally cynical or skeptical here. We have spent, in fact, using polio as our starting point, decades refining and adding on to the safety and regulatory procedures in place for ensuring that drugs that get to market are not just safe, but also effective at the same time, and that effectiveness does not compromise safety, and vice versa. And what we've heard in the last couple of months is some of our leaders telling us that a number of regulatory protocols are now being set aside, and that they're being set aside in the interest of bringing effective drugs to market quickly. I hope this doesn't have negative consequences. One can never say. I just know that we spent decades putting these regulatory processes in place for a reason, and I hope that, one, we put them back in place when and if we can put this pandemic behind us, and two, that the ways in which we're trying to make vaccine development more efficient now don't come at any steep costs. We will already be dealing with steep with steep costs because we will face distribution problems. We will face problems of equity. Even if we have enough vaccine for everybody, there will be those who have the privilege to say, I'm not comfortable getting it until 5 million people have been vaccinated. And then there will be those who say, I have to get vaccinated because I have to go to work and I have to make sure that I am safe and that I can provide for my family. So I guarantee that we will see problems of equity. Historians aren't supposed to guarantee anything about the future, but this is one thing I feel concerned about.
What didn't exist in the 1950s is genomic science. So how does the cracking of the gene help with the development of vaccines today?
Well, in a couple of ways. I'm not a scientist, so I'll just say a few brief things, but from my understanding of it is once you can see the genetics of a virus like this, scientists can design a vaccine very quickly. That means they can essentially, like an architect, come up with the blueprint for it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be quick to build it or to test it, but you can design it very quickly, and you can design it in a very refined, specific way. It also means that you can produce vaccines that look potentially very different from the polio vaccines that we've been talking about. They don't contain a whole virus in either killed or weakened form. They just contain genetic material from the virus, or that resembles the virus's genetic material, and that's familiar enough that the immune system in the human body recognizes it and mounts an immune response. So yeah, I'll highlight those two differences.
Last month there was a headline in the Washington Post that read that coronavirus may never go away even with the vaccine. So are we as a global society looking at eradication of COVID-19 or containment?
I think that we probably need to focus on both, but one thing that I am struck by, again, as a historian, not a scientist, is that I am now living through a pandemic that has caused the kind of social disorder that I have read about in history books and have never lived through in my own lifetime. Polio is a close example, but that happened before I was born. But if you look at the history of infectious disease, you see diseases such as, smallpox is one, plague is another, yellow fever, cholera. Smallpox is the only one on that list that I mentioned that has been eradicated. Polio is close to eradication. Plague is still with us, and people think, oh, plague, we haven't had that since, the Black Death of the Middle Ages, but it's still a presence. We just contain it and we manage it. And that is a possibility for coronavirus. We may never develop a vaccine against it, and it may be with us for centuries. It may be with us for millennia. And if it is, it will mean that we have found ways of not just containing it, but adapting to it as well.
So in our few minutes left, I want to tell people that you wrote a book about vaccines called Vaccine Nation, and published in 2015, still widely available if people are interested in it. And what is your current book project that you're working on?
Right now I'm actually working on a book about the pesticide DDT and how essentially our interpretation of scientific results changes over time, not just because science changes, but because culture, politics, economics changes, and that all prompts us to look at the science and understand it differently. It'll be a very different look at the pesticide DDT and its very contentious history.
So as you mentioned, as we close here, that you're living through history as a public health and medical historian, what are you and your colleagues looking at as we go through the coronavirus experience, and what kind of data are you gathering that will help record this for history and help a public's future understanding of it?
A lot of fellow historians are looking at current media coverage and social media discourse, and also government reports and studies, and trying to amass digital archives of the current pandemic. I think others are also thinking about what those of us who are historians of medicine know well, which has been proven with striking clarity with the current pandemic, which is that a pandemic grossly exposes the inequities in a society. And if there are problems before the pandemic will worsen them. And we have seen that with this one. And it is such a striking illustration of something that history has shown us over and over again, whether it was polio, whether it was smallpox, whether it was cholera in the 19th century. All of these diseases show us the difference between those who have privilege and those who don't. And we're definitely seeing that this time too.
When are you expecting to welcome students back into the classroom again?
Oh, I shouldn't speak for my university. I've been told that we will welcome small groups of students back into our classrooms and much larger groups online. And I'm still meeting with students through the summer too, a small selection of students through the summer who are working on some of this work with me.
Well, thank you very much for giving C-SPAN an hour. Dr. Elena Konis is a public health and medical historian at the UC Berkeley. And in a previous life, she was a journalist and a columnist. And we're glad to have all of that experience melded into your conversation with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.